Welcome to this video introducing the PRISM tool, our Paediatric Rehabilitation Ingredients Measure. This video assumes that you have read this paper published recently in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology. You'll need to read this paper to understand what's happening in this video, and in particular you need to be familiar with Table 1 in the paper and our rationale for thinking about pediatric neurorehabilitation as comprising a blend of ingredients drawn from this menu of 11 potential items. So with that preamble, let's move on to the online PRISM calculator. When you launch the website, this is what you see. The first thing you see when you open the page is this menu of 11 items, which should look familiar to you, although we've shortened them slightly for brevity. If you hover over one, a little bubble pops up just to remind and clarify what we're including under each of these items. So what we're going to do, as explained in the paper, is think about the totality of the rehabilitation package that the team are delivering for this for a child at present, and select some items from this menu that we think are currently being delivered for this young person and the family. Now, as mentioned in the paper, it's best not to just tick every box for the sake of ticking it, for reasons that will become clear. We suggest you limit yourself to certainly not more than 9 of these items, and in practice we've usually found that you can limit yourself to 5, 6, occasionally 7. So to illustrate this, I'm going to bring a particular young person to mind. So this is a 14-year-old young man who has sustained a traumatic ABI. It's a very focal ABI that's left him with a dense right hemiplegia, but otherwise he is very cognitively intact, fully oriented, and very motivated and very determined to regain function down his affected side. He has a single parent mother who is devastated by what's happened to her son, and emotional support for her is clearly going to be an important issue as well as for him. So let's think about which of these items are relevant to this young man currently. Certainly active practice. At the moment, I'm going to take the view that we're not asking mum to actively practice any skills. There's certainly some knowledge that needs to be transmitted to the young person. They need to learn, for example, strategies for putting on a shirt in the presence of a hemiplegia, and there are certainly facts that mum needs to learn about the ABI, about what's ahead, and so on. As we discuss in the paper, we are using PRISM to talk about what we're currently actually delivering for a given child or young person. So we're not trying to think about what should be happening, and nor are we thinking about what will be happening in a few weeks' time. So for this young person, in a few weeks' time, community-facing interventions are going to be very important. We're going to be contacting this young person's school, etc. But we're not doing that yet, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. Under other management, this again, to remind you, refers to issues such as tone management. So this young man does have some increased tone down the right side. We've provided an AFO to help with foot positioning. As mentioned, there's certainly work going on to support the young person themselves emotionally and his mother emotionally. But these more community-facing adaptations we're leaving unchecked for the moment. So here are the 6 ingredient mediator combinations that we've selected. If wanted, you could click clear all and start over. And here we have some sliders. Again, what's going on here should be clear if you've read the paper, but in brief, what we're looking at here is every pairwise combination of the items we've selected at the top. So we start with the first ingredient, child's active practice, and we've listed it against the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth item. Then we have item 2, child's explicit knowledge, against the third, the fourth, fifth, and the sixth. The third item, family learning knowledge, against the fourth, the fifth, and sixth. The fourth against the fifth and the sixth, and finally the fifth against the sixth. And then for every pair we have a slider which can move from the extreme left to the extreme right. If the slider is in the center, we are stating that the components present at the left and right hand ends of the slider are present to an equal extent, to an equal proportion. But if one is present to a greater extent than the other, we can move the slider appropriately either to the left or to the right. There are 8 steps from the center out to either side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And there are these little bubbles that pop up that try to help convey the degree of the emphasis. Whilst it's usually fairly easy to know which way to move the slider, it can be hard to judge how far to move the slider in a given direction, how much to emphasize one item over the other. It may be helpful to think that this in the center of the items are equal. Moving at one point is 2 times more important, 3 times more important, 4 times more important, 5, 6, 7, 8, and finally 9 times more important. That's the AHP convention. So coming back to this particular child or young person, certainly we're doing active practice and we're doing explicit knowledge transmission, but the active practice is by far the more important. So the slider needs to go to the left. It's probably 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm going to say 6 times more important. It's obviously a subjective judgment, but it's still a valuable one. Moving on to the next slider, we have child's active practice against the families, in this case mum's learning explicit knowledge. Again, I'm sure the slider goes to the left. The question is how far? 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6, 7. I'm going to say this is much more important because we're actually there isn't too much explicit knowledge to convey to mum. Next slider, child's active practice against other management. So this other management would include tone, posture, seating, and so on. As I mentioned, this young person, we've provided an AFO, an ankle-foot orthosis, but for the sake of argument, let's say that we provided that last week, so that's not really a focus this week. So again, I'm going to move this slider well out to the left. Now this next one is slightly harder. We've got the child's active practice and the emotional support for the child. They're both pretty important, but I still think the active practice is a bigger focus for the moment, but not by much. So I'm going to say perhaps twice as or 3 times as important. So for brevity, I won't discuss each of these remaining slider settings in detail, but assume for now these are the settings that I think best reflect the relative proportions of ingredients in play for this young person and his mother this week. Okay, so I've finished. And you will see that we have a flag up here, that our internal consistency is not brilliant. And again, this is discussed in the paper. This CR statistic is something called the consistency ratio, and we're looking for a value ideally less than 10%, less than 0.1. So we're just over the threshold, suggesting there's some internal inconsistency. What the system tries to do is guide you as to where that inconsistency lies. So the system is configured to flag up the 3 most inconsistent settings. The most inconsistent is red, the second most inconsistent this pale yellow, and the third most inconsistent this purple color. You'll see there's a little, each has an arrow next to it indicating which way the slider should move to improve the consistency, and there's a number which suggests how many stops it should improve. So if we look at where the flags have appeared, there's clearly something about emotional health and particularly other management. And I think the problem perhaps is that, and this comes with practice to a certain extent, this rating is too far to the left. And in fact, I only need to move, you'll see that as I move this to the right, I only need to move it a couple of spots before the consistency statistic drops below 10%, below 0.1. And in fact, that is a better statistic. So we're now well under 10%, and this rating is internally consistent. So what we need to do finally is to click this export button, and what you see at that point is going to depend a little bit on what browser you're using and what operating system, but you will have downloaded a little spreadsheet which opens in Excel or a similar program. This is the matrix that you saw here, but the bit you're more interested in is this piece at the top, which, just for clarity, I will paste down here so you can just see this a little more straightforwardly. So this is the output that you're most interested in from the PRISM. So these are the proportions of the ingredients implicit in those ratings that we made in the online calculator. So we're saying that the rehabilitation interventions that we're currently giving to this young man comprise 43% active practice, just over 6% child's learning of knowledge, 4% mum's learning of knowledge, 3% other management of activity and function, but quite a bit of emotional health and family emotional health. So these percentages, these fractions add up to 1, and if you wanted to, for example, you could show that data as a graph. It's worth just emphasizing that no data is stored on the website. This is just an online calculator. It does a sum and exports the result as the spreadsheet. So there's no confidentiality issues involved. No data is stored online. Finally, as briefly mentioned, if at some point in the future you find that the PRISM website is no longer operational, there are generic online calculators. This is just one that I found currently. The main difference between the bespoke PRISM system and a website such as this is that you will need to pre-populate the criteria. So you would have to put in something like and then obviously the details of how the slider is implemented will vary from website to website, but the general principles are the same. So thank you. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me at my email address. And thank you for your interest in PRISM.